Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Edward IV, England's first Yorkist king, and one of its most captivating monarchs. This tall, handsome and charismatic ruler won his crown through force, lost it through scandal, and fought his way back to power in one of history's most remarkable comebacks. We'll softly explore his rise from teenage warrior to king, his shocking secret marriage that shattered political alliances, his dramatic exile and triumphant return, and finally his golden years of luxury and excess that ultimately led to dynastic tragedy. All of this unfolds during the tumultuous Wars of the Roses, when England's noble families battled for the throne in a conflict that would shape the nation forever. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying these gentle historical tales. I'd love to hear from you too. Don't be shy. Leave a comment telling me which part of Edward's story you're most curious about. Or perhaps share your favorite medieval king or queen. Your thoughts always bring such warmth to our little community here. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to keep these soothing historical journeys coming your way. So cozy, up under your softest blankets, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 15th century England lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. We're so glad you found your way to our peaceful corner of history. Edward, later known as King Edward IV of England, entered this world on a spring morning in 1442 in the ancient city of Rouen, France. The soft April air carried the sounds of a bustling medieval town as church bells announced the birth of a child who would one day shake the very foundations of the English monarchy. Little could anyone have imagined that this infant, born in a foreign land while his father served the crown, would grow to become one of England's most striking and controversial kings. The child's father, Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, stood as one of the most powerful nobles in all of England. His wealth was legendary, his bloodline impeccable, and his claim to the English throne stronger than that of the king himself. Through both parents, young Edward inherited royal blood that traced back to the great Edward III, making him not merely noble, but a prince with destiny written in his very genes. His mother, Cecily Neville, known throughout the realm as the Rose of Raby for her extraordinary beauty, brought her own magnificent heritage to this union. The Nevilles were a family of enormous influence, controlling vast swaths of northern England and commanding the loyalty of thousands. Together, Richard and Cecily created a household that resembled a royal court, more than a noble family's residence. Picture, if you will, the grand castle of Ludlow, nestled in the Welsh marches, where young Edward spent his childhood years. Ancient stone walls rose majestically above rolling green hills, while tapestries depicting heroic battles and noble hunts decorated the great halls within. Here, surrounded by the finest tutors money could provide, Edward learned the arts of war and peace that would define his future reign. Even as a child, Edward possessed qualities that set him apart from other noble youth. Visitors to Ludlow remarked upon his unusual height. He would grow to tower over 6 feet, making him a giant among men of his era. His fair hair caught the sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, and his grey eyes held an intelligence and warmth that drew people to him like moths to flame. The boy's education extended far beyond books and Latin prayers. In the castle's courtyard, Master-at-Arms taught him to wield sword and lance with growing expertise. He learned to sit a horse as if born to the saddle, to command men with natural authority, and to inspire loyalty through personal charisma rather than fear. These lessons would prove invaluable in the bloody years ahead. But Edward's childhood, however privileged, unfolded against a backdrop of growing political tension that would soon shatter the peace of England. His father's claim to the throne was not merely theoretical. By the strict rules of inheritance, Richard of York possessed a stronger legal right to rule than King Henry VI, whose grandfather had seized power through force and rebellion decades earlier. The political storm that had been brewing throughout Edward's youth finally broke when he reached his teenage years. England's king, Henry VI, was a gentle, pious man, utterly unsuited to the demands of medieval kingship. Where a king should have been strong, Henry was weak. Where he should have inspired confidence, Henry's periodic descents into madness terrified his subjects. Where he should have provided decisive leadership, Henry allowed corrupt favourites to manipulate him for their own gain. The realm groaned under the weight of military defeats in France, economic troubles at home, and the increasingly obvious incompetence of royal government. Noble families watched their king's failures with growing alarm, and many began to whisper that perhaps a change of dynasty might serve England better. It was into this atmosphere of political crisis that Edward emerged as a young man. At 17, he already stood tall and commanded attention in any room he entered. His voice carried the authority of born leadership, and his easy smile could charm friend and foe alike. Those who met him remarked that here was a prince who looked and acted like a king should, confident, capable, and inspiring. The spark that ignited open warfare came in 1455, when Edward's father finally decided to act upon his superior claim to the throne. The first battle of this civil war erupted at St. Albans, where Yorkist forces defeated the king's army and captured Henry VI himself. But this victory proved temporary, as Henry's formidable queen, Margaret of Anjou, rallied the Lancastrian cause and prepared for a longer, bloodier conflict. Young Edward threw himself into his family's cause with the enthusiasm of youth and the determination of a born warrior. He learned the harsh realities of civil war, that kingdoms were won and lost on battlefields, that loyalty could shift like morning mist, and that mercy was often a luxury no king could afford. The conflict that historians would later name the Wars of the Roses had begun in earnest, pitting the White Rose of York against the Red Rose of Lancaster in a struggle that would drench England in blood and forever change the nature of English monarchy. Edward, still just a teenager, found himself at the very heart of this momentous struggle. In 1459, the political situation deteriorated dramatically. A Yorkist defeat at Ludford Bridge forced Edward's father to flee to Ireland for safety, while Edward himself, along with his cousin Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, escaped to Calais. This fortress city, England's last continental possession, became the base for Yorkist plans to return and claim what they saw as their rightful inheritance. Calais proved to be the perfect refuge for the young prince. Here, surrounded by loyal soldiers and advised by experienced military commanders, Edward learned the intricate arts of strategy and statecraft. The Earl of Warwick, who would later earn the title Kingmaker for his role in Edward's rise to power, became both mentor and close ally to the ambitious young man. Warwick himself was a fascinating figure, wealthy beyond measure, politically astute, and commanding respect throughout Europe for his military prowess. Under his guidance, Edward began to understand that claiming a throne required more than just superior bloodline. It demanded careful planning, strategic alliances, and the ability to inspire men to fight and die for your cause. The months in Calais transformed Edward from an eager young nobleman into a genuine political and military leader. He learned to read the complex currents of European politics, understanding how foreign powers might be turned into allies or enemies depending upon circumstances. He mastered the art of commanding diverse groups of men, from noble knights to common soldiers, welding them into effective fighting forces through personal magnetism and shared purpose. But perhaps most importantly, Edward learned patience. The desire to return to England and claim his birthright burned within him like a flame. But Warwick taught him that premature action could destroy their cause forever. They would return to England when the moment was right, when their enemies were unprepared, and when victory seemed assured. That moment came in 1460, when political conditions in England had deteriorated to the point where many previously neutral nobles began to question whether Henry VI's continued reign served the kingdom's best interests. Economic troubles, military defeats, and the increasingly obvious mental instability of the king had created an atmosphere ripe for change. Edward, now 18, and possessing all the confidence of youth combined with genuine military talent, sailed from Calais with Warwick and a small but determined army. Their landing at Sandwich marked the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most remarkable political and military campaigns in English history. The speed and success of their initial advance astonished even their supporters. Town after town opened its gates to welcome the young prince, and nobles who had remained neutral now flocked to the Yorkist banners. Edward's personal charisma proved to be a political weapon as effective as any sword or cannon. In London, the reception was triumphant. The common people, weary of Henry VI's ineffective rule and attracted by Edward's obvious vigour and competence, cheered the Yorkist forces through the streets. Here was a prince who looked like a king should look, tall, handsome, confident, and radiating the kind of natural authority that inspired confidence in uncertain times. The Battle of Northampton in July 1460 proved decisive in establishing Yorkist control over the realm. Edward commanded one of 3 divisions in this crucial engagement, demonstrating tactical skill that impressed even veteran soldiers. The victory captured King Henry VI himself, leaving the Yorkists in control of both the capital and the monarch. When Edward's father returned from Ireland, many expected him to immediately claim the throne. Instead, a compromise was reached, the Act of Accord, which allowed Henry VI to remain king for his lifetime, but designated Richard of York and his heirs as his successors. This arrangement might have brought peace to England, had it not been for the determination of Queen Margaret to secure her son's inheritance. The Queen, a woman of remarkable strength and political acumen, refused to accept any arrangement that disinherited her child. From her base in Scotland, she rallied Lancastrian forces and prepared for renewed warfare. The compromise that had seemed to offer peace instead became merely a brief pause before even bloodier conflict resumed. Edward's world changed forever on a cold December day in 1460, when news arrived that his father and younger brother Edmund had been killed at the Battle of Wakefield. The shock of this loss was devastating. Not only had Edward lost his beloved father and brother, but the Yorkist cause itself seemed on the verge of collapse. But rather than despair, Edward felt a fierce determination rising within him. At just 18 years of age, he now bore the full weight of his family's claim to the throne. The boy who had been Earl of March was dead. In his place stood a man who would stop at nothing to claim what he saw as his rightful inheritance. The transformation in Edward's bearing was immediately apparent to all who knew him. The easygoing charm remained, but now it was underlaid with steel. His grey eyes, once merely intelligent, now held the cold calculation of a born ruler. When he spoke, men listened not just because of his pleasant manner, but because they sensed the power and determination that lay beneath the surface courtesy. Contemporary observers remarked upon Edward's remarkable presence during this crucial period. Philippe de Comines, a sophisticated diplomat who encountered many of Europe's rulers, described Edward as handsome, affable, and energetic, but also noted the sense of coiled power that seemed to radiate from the young prince. He was no mere pretty nobleman, but a genuine leader of men. The winter months of 1460 to 1461 proved crucial in determining Edward's character and future. Faced with the need to rally dispirited Yorkist forces while simultaneously planning military campaigns against vengeful Lancastrian armies, Edward demonstrated abilities that surprised even his closest supporters. The charming young prince revealed himself to be a natural strategist, capable of inspiring confidence in the darkest circumstances. Edward's first independent command came when he was sent to deal with Lancastrian insurgency in Wales. This assignment proved to be the making of him as a military commander. Far from the guiding hand of experienced advisors like Warwick, Edward was forced to rely upon his own judgment and leadership abilities. The Welsh campaign revealed Edward's gift for rapid decision-making and his intuitive understanding of medieval warfare. He understood that in civil war, speed often mattered more than superior numbers, that striking quickly and decisively could achieve results impossible through more cautious approaches. This lesson would serve him well throughout his career, but it was the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in February 1461 that truly announced Edward's arrival as a force in English politics. Facing a Lancastrian army led by experienced commanders, the young prince achieved a stunning victory that established his reputation as a military genius. The battle was fought in harsh winter conditions with snow and freezing rain, making movement difficult and visibility poor. Edward's tactical brilliance shone through these challenging conditions. He positioned his forces to take advantage of the terrain, used his archers to devastating effect, and personally led cavalry charges that broke the enemy line. But perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated the kind of personal courage that inspired his men to follow him anywhere. The victory at Mortimer's Cross had consequences that extended far beyond the military. News of Edward's triumph spread throughout England, establishing him as a legitimate claimant to the throne in his own right, rather than merely his father's heir. Noble families that had remained neutral began to reconsider their positions, sensing that the Yorkist cause was far from finished. Edward's handling of victory also revealed important aspects of his character. He could be generous to defeated enemies who submitted gracefully, but ruthless toward those who continued to oppose him. This combination of mercy and severity would become a hallmark of his later reign, as he learned to balance the competing demands of justice and political necessity. The young prince's personal magnetism proved as valuable as his military skills. Soldiers who served under him developed an almost fanatical loyalty, impressed by a commander who shared their dangers and looked out for their welfare. Unlike many noble commanders who directed battles from safe distances, Edward led from the front, his tall figure easily recognizable as he wielded sword and battle-axe with deadly effectiveness. But Edward understood that military victory alone would not secure his throne. The complex politics of 15th century England required careful management of competing noble interests, skillful diplomacy, and the ability to present oneself as a legitimate ruler worthy of obedience. The teenage warrior began to transform himself into a genuine statesman. The death of his father had freed Edward from the constraints of being merely an heir. Now he could pursue his own vision of kingship, one based upon personal charisma, military prowess, and direct connection with his subjects, rather than reliance upon traditional noble hierarchies. This approach would prove both his greatest strength and ultimately a source of dangerous weakness. As winter gave way to spring in 1461, Edward prepared for what he knew would be the decisive campaign of his young life. Queen Margaret had assembled the largest Lancastrian army yet seen. drawing upon the resources of northern England and Scotland to create a force that outnumbered anything the Yorkists could muster. The coming battle would determine not just Edward's personal fate, but the future direction of English monarchy. The stage was set for one of the most important battles in English history, a confrontation that would establish Edward's claim to the throne or destroy the Yorkist cause forever. The handsome young prince, who had learned to command men through force of personality, would soon discover whether charm and courage were sufficient to win a crown. The pale dawn light of March 29th, 1461, revealed a landscape transformed by winter's harsh grip. Snow fell steadily across the Yorkshire countryside near the village of Towton, creating an almost ethereal setting for what would become the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. As Edward stood before his assembled army, barely 19 years old, he understood that this single day would determine whether he would die as a rebel or live as a king. The Battle of Towton represented far more than a simple military engagement. It was the culmination of Edward's remarkable transformation from grieving son to determined claimant to the English throne. In the 3 months since his father's death, the young prince had demonstrated abilities that astounded even his most ardent supporters. Now, facing a Lancastrian army that outnumbered his own forces, Edward would discover whether his natural gifts were sufficient to achieve the seemingly impossible. The weather conditions that Palm Sunday morning were almost apocalyptic. A fierce snowstorm, driven by howling winds, reduced visibility to mere yards and made movement across the battlefield treacherous. Lesser commanders might have delayed the engagement, but Edward recognized that nature's fury could be turned to his advantage if he possessed the courage to act decisively. Edward's tactical genius revealed itself in his positioning of archers. Understanding that the strong wind was blowing from behind his lines toward the enemy, he ordered his bowmen to advance and release volleys of arrows that carried far beyond their normal range. The Lancastrian archers, responding to this attack, found their own arrows falling short due to the adverse wind conditions. The psychological impact of this early success rippled through both armies. Edward's men, seeing their arrows striking home while enemy missiles fell harmlessly in the snow before their lines, felt confidence surge through their ranks. Conversely, the Lancastrians found themselves under attack from an enemy they could barely see through the driving snow, their own response proving ineffective. But Edward understood that archery alone would not win this crucial battle. At the decisive moment, he personally led a cavalry charge that smashed into the Lancastrian left flank with devastating effect. Contemporary accounts describe the young prince fighting with almost superhuman energy, his distinctive height and golden hair making him easily recognizable as he cut through enemy ranks. The battle raged for hours in conditions that would have tested the endurance of the hardiest warriors. Men fought hand to hand in ankle-deep snow, their weapons slippery with blood and ice, while the wind carried the screams of wounded and dying soldiers across the frozen battlefield. Through it all, Edward's presence could be felt wherever the fighting was fiercest, inspiring his men through personal example rather than distant commands. The turning point came when Edward's tactical reserve, held back despite desperate pleas to commit them earlier, struck the Lancastrian flank at precisely the right moment. This perfectly timed assault shattered enemy resistance and turned an already difficult situation into complete rout. What had been a hard-fought battle became a massacre as Lancastrian forces fled in panic. The aftermath of Towton revealed both Edward's military genius and his understanding of the harsh realities of medieval warfare. Contemporary estimates suggest that nearly 30,000 men died that day, an enormous casualty count that reflected both the scale of the Siasi engagement and the particularly vicious nature of civil war. Edward's victory was complete and decisive, but it came at a price that would haunt England for generations. King Henry VI, along with his Queen Margaret of Anjou and their young son Prince Edward, fled toward Scotland as news of the catastrophic defeat reached them. Their cause, which had seemed so strong just days earlier, now lay in ruins on the blood-soaked fields around Towton. The Lancastrian claim to the throne had not been destroyed, but it had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. Edward's conduct in victory revealed important aspects of his character that would define his later reign. While he could be ruthless toward enemies who continued to resist, he showed remarkable clemency toward those who submitted to his authority. This combination of strength and mercy helped to establish his legitimacy in the eyes of nobles who had remained neutral during the conflict. The march to London following Towton resembled a triumphal procession more than a military movement. Town after town opened its gates to welcome the victorious young prince, while nobles who had hesitated to commit themselves to either side now hastened to offer their allegiance to the apparent winner. Edward's personal charisma proved as effective in peace as it had been in war. London's reception of Edward was nothing short of rapturous. The common people, weary of Henry VI's ineffective rule and impressed by the obvious competence and vigour of his replacement, lined the streets to cheer the handsome young victor. Here was a king who looked the part, tall, confident, militarily proven, and radiating the kind of natural authority that inspired confidence in uncertain times. The coronation of Edward IV on June 28, 1461, marked not just the beginning of a new reign, but the establishment of an entirely new approach to English kingship. At just 19, Edward was the youngest man to claim the English throne through military conquest since William the Conqueror. Unlike previous usurpers who had relied primarily upon noble support, Edward's appeal extended directly to the common people. Edward's coronation ceremony was deliberately designed to emphasize both his legitimacy and his accessibility, while maintaining all the traditional pomp and ceremony expected of such occasions. The new king made sure that ordinary citizens could witness the proceedings. This innovation reflected his understanding that successful kingship required popular support, as well as noble acceptance. The early months of Edward's reign revealed the enormous challenges facing any medieval monarch attempting to establish a new dynasty. Lancastrian resistance continued in the northern counties, where local loyalties remained strong, and Scottish support provided hope for eventual restoration. Meanwhile, the financial cost of the recent military campaigns had left the royal treasury nearly empty. Edward's response to these challenges demonstrated the political sophistication that lay beneath his youthful exterior. Rather than attempting to rule through force alone, he began the careful work of building coalitions and managing competing interests. His cousin Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, naturally assumed the role of chief advisor, bringing both enormous wealth and extensive political connections to the new regime. The relationship between Edward and Warwick during these early years was crucial to the stability of the new dynasty. Warwick's resources had been essential to Edward's military success, while his diplomatic skills and European connections provided the new king with international credibility. In return, Edward granted Warwick unprecedented influence over policy and enormous rewards in terms of lands and offices. But even as Edward relied heavily upon Warwick's support, careful observers could detect signs of the independent spirit that would later cause friction between the two men. The young king possessed his own vision of how England should be governed, and while he was willing to accept guidance, he would not indefinitely remain junior partner in their alliance. The northern campaigns of 1462 to 1464 tested both Edward's military skills and his political judgment. Lancastrian forces, supported by Scottish arms and the French gold, managed to capture several important castles and briefly threatened to establish a permanent base for resistance. Edward's response combined military force with skillful diplomacy, gradually wearing down enemy resistance while avoiding the kind of devastating battles that might have weakened his own forces. One of Edward's most controversial decisions during this period involved his treatment of defeated Lancastrian nobles. Rather than following the traditional practice of execution or permanent exile, the young king attempted to win over former enemies through clemency and inclusion in his government. This policy reflected both genuine political wisdom and perhaps dangerous naivety about the nature of aristocratic loyalty. The case of Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, illustrates both the promise and the peril of Edward's conciliatory approach. Somerset had been one of the most committed Lancastrian commanders, but after his capture, Edward made extraordinary efforts to convert him into a loyal supporter. The two men spent long periods together, with Edward even organising tournaments in Somerset's honour. These efforts at reconciliation initially seemed successful, but they proved deeply unpopular with Edward's existing supporters, who saw no reason to trust former enemies with positions of influence and authority. Popular opposition to Somerset became so intense that Edward was eventually forced to send him away from court for his own safety. This experience taught the young king important lessons about the limits of royal mercy in a society still scarred by civil war. The final elimination of organised Lancastrian resistance came with the Battle of Hexham in May 1464, where Edward's forces achieved another decisive victory. This triumph effectively ended the military phase of Lancastrian opposition, though sporadic resistance would continue for several more years. With his throne finally secure from immediate military threat, Edward could turn his attention to the longer-term challenges of governing his kingdom. The transformation of Edward from teenage rebel to established monarch was now complete. In just 3 years, he had claimed a throne through military conquest, defeated all organised opposition, and begun the process of creating a new governmental structure. His success had been built upon an almost unprecedented combination of personal charisma, military genius, and political acumen. But even as Edward celebrated these remarkable achievements, the seeds of future troubles were already being sown. His relationship with Warwick, while still close, showed signs of strain as the young king began to assert his independence. More ominously, Edward's personal appetites, particularly his notorious interest in beautiful women, were beginning to attract attention and comment. Contemporary observers noted that Edward's charm was not confined to the battlefield or council chamber. His tall, handsome figure and easy manner made him enormously attractive to women of all social classes, while his position as an unmarried king made him one of Europe's most eligible bachelors. Diplomatic negotiations were already underway for a politically advantageous marriage that would strengthen England's international position. But Edward had his own ideas about marriage, ideas that would soon shatter the political arrangements so carefully constructed by his advisors. The young king, who had shown such wisdom in military and political matters, was about to make a personal decision that would change the entire trajectory of his reign and ultimately threaten the stability of his hard-won throne. The stage was set for one of the most shocking scandals in English royal history, a scandal that would transform Edward from beloved young monarch into a controversial figure whose personal choices would eventually bring his dynasty to the brink of destruction. The warrior king, who had won his crown through force of arms, was about to discover that the greatest threats to his reign might come not from external enemies, but from his own heart. As the year 1464 dawned, Edward IV seemed to have everything a medieval monarch could desire: a secure throne, loyal supporters, military reputation, and the admiration of his subjects. He stood at the pinnacle of success, master of his own destiny, and apparently capable of achieving anything he set his mind to accomplish. But destiny has a way of confounding even the most confident rulers, and Edward was about to encounter a force more powerful than any army he had ever faced. A force that would reshape his reign, challenge his relationships with his closest allies, and ultimately determine the fate of his entire dynasty. The handsome young king, who had conquered England through charm and courage, was about to be conquered himself by a love that would prove both his greatest joy and his most dangerous weakness. The morning mist hung low over the ancient forest of Whittlebury, as Elizabeth Woodville made her way along the winding path toward the great oak tree where she had been told the king might pass. It was late spring in 1464, and the countryside burst with new life. Wildflowers carpeted the forest floor, birds sang in the awakening trees, and the air itself seemed pregnant with possibility. Little did this young widow know that she was about to set in motion a scandal that would echo through the corridors of English power for centuries to come. Elizabeth was a woman of remarkable beauty, even by the standards of an age that prized feminine loveliness above almost all other qualities. Contemporary descriptions speak of her flowing golden hair, her piercing blue eyes, and a grace of movement that seemed almost ethereal. But beneath this captivating exterior lay a sharp intelligence and a determination forged by the harsh realities of 15th century life. Born around 1437, Elizabeth had known both privilege and hardship. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, came from one of Europe's most distinguished noble families and had been married to John, Duke of Bedford, the brother of the legendary King Henry V. But Jacquetta's secret second marriage to Sir Richard Woodville, a mere knight, had caused enormous scandal and temporarily banished her from court society. Elizabeth's first marriage had been to Sir John Grey of Groby, a Lancastrian knight who died fighting against Edward's forces at the Second Battle of Saint-Cyr, Albans, in 1461. This tragedy left Elizabeth a widow at barely 24, with 2 young sons to support and a complex legal battle over her late husband's estates. The Yorkist victory had made her situation even more precarious, as former Lancastrian supporters found themselves dispossessed and vulnerable. It was this legal dispute that brought Elizabeth to seek an audience with the young king. Her late husband's family was attempting to deny her sons their inheritance, claiming that the marriage had been invalid or that the children were illegitimate. Without royal intervention, Elizabeth faced the prospect of destitution, her children stripped of their birthright and her own future utterly uncertain. The legend of how Elizabeth and Edward first met has been told and retold countless times, each version adding new details to what has become one of history's most romantic stories. According to the most popular account, Elizabeth waited beneath a massive oak tree with her 2 young sons, knowing that the king was expected to pass that way while returning from a hunting expedition. When Edward's party came into view, Elizabeth stepped forward and knelt in the mud, her children beside her, presenting a petition for royal justice. The sight that greeted the young king must have been extraordinary. A stunningly beautiful woman, clearly of gentle birth despite her modest dress, pleading for protection with a dignity and grace that immediately set her apart from the usual crowd of petitioners. Edward, now 22, and at the height of his physical and personal magnetism, was immediately captivated. Here was a woman unlike any he had encountered. Beautiful, certainly, but also possessed of an inner strength that had enabled her to survive tragedy and continue fighting for her children's future. Their initial conversation, conducted with all the formality required by royal protocol, nevertheless crackled with an undeniable attraction. What happened next depends upon which version of the story one chooses to believe. The most romantic account suggests that Edward was so smitten that he attempted to seduce Elizabeth on the spot. only to be firmly rebuffed. In one particularly dramatic version, Elizabeth held a dagger to her own throat and declared that she would rather die than dishonor herself, even for a king. Whether or not these specific details are accurate, there is no doubt that Edward found himself facing a woman unlike any other in his experience. Elizabeth possessed both the beauty and the strength of character to resist royal advances, a combination that proved utterly irresistible to a king accustomed to having his every desire fulfilled without question. The relationship that developed between Edward and Elizabeth over the following weeks was conducted in the deepest secrecy. The king found excuses to return to the area around Elizabeth's home, officially hunting or inspecting royal properties, but actually seeking opportunities to spend time with this remarkable woman who had so thoroughly captured his imagination. For Elizabeth, the king's attention presented both incredible opportunity and enormous danger. She was intelligent enough to understand that royal mistresses, however pampered during their period of favor, ultimately faced abandonment and often disgrace. But she was also woman enough to be genuinely attracted to this tall, charismatic young monarch who combined physical appeal with the ultimate symbol of power and success. The secret courtship that followed was conducted with all the elaborate discretion that medieval romance required. Edward would slip away from his official duties to meet Elizabeth in secluded locations, their conversations ranging from practical matters concerning her legal troubles to the kind of intimate exchanges that marked their growing emotional connection. Elizabeth's handling of this delicate situation revealed the political sophistication that lay beneath her beautiful exterior. She understood that her only hope of securing a permanent place in Edward's life lay not in submission, but in maintaining her independence and dignity. This approach required enormous courage, as well as an intuitive understanding of the king's psychology. The turning point came when Edward, frustrated by Elizabeth's continued resistance to his advances, finally proposed marriage. This was not the casual suggestion of a powerful man seeking to overcome a woman's scruples, but a genuine offer from a king who found himself genuinely in love for perhaps the first time in his life. Elizabeth's response was carefully calculated. She accepted Edward's proposal, but insisted upon certain conditions that revealed her understanding of the political realities surrounding their union. The marriage must be kept secret until the king chose to announce it publicly, protecting both of them from the immediate political consequences of such an unprecedented match. The secret wedding ceremony took place on May 1st, 1464, at the Woodville family home, possibly in the small chapel at Groby. The date was symbolically significant. May Day had been associated with love and fertility since ancient times, making it a fitting choice for what was clearly a marriage based on genuine affection rather than political calculation. The ceremony itself was extraordinarily intimate, with only Elizabeth's mother and a handful of trusted servants as witnesses. No grand cathedral, no assembled nobles, no magnificent celebration. Just two people who had fallen deeply in love exchanging vows in the simplest possible setting. For a king who could have commanded the most elaborate wedding ceremony in Europe, this choice reflected both the secrecy required and perhaps Edward's desire for authentic emotion over political theatre. The hours following the ceremony were said to be among the happiest of Edward's life. For once, the responsibilities of kingship fell away, and he could simply be a man in love with his new wife. Contemporary accounts, written years later when the political consequences had become clear, still captured something of the joy and passion that marked those first private moments of the royal marriage. But reality could not be held at bay indefinitely. Edward returned to his royal duties, while Elizabeth remained at her family home, both of them bound to secrecy about their new relationship. For the next 4 months, Edward lived a double life, publicly available as England's most eligible bachelor, while privately cherishing his secret marriage to the woman he loved. The strain of maintaining this deception must have been enormous for both parties. Edward was forced to participate in diplomatic negotiations for his marriage to foreign princesses, knowing that he was already married to a woman he could not acknowledge. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had to endure the uncertainty of a relationship that might be revealed or repudiated at any moment. During this period, Elizabeth discovered that she was pregnant with Edward's child. This development added new urgency to the question of when and how to reveal their marriage to the world. A royal bastard might be acknowledged and provided for, but a legitimate heir to the throne could not indefinitely remain hidden from public view. The secret began to unravel in September 1464, when Edward's continued evasion of marriage negotiations finally forced his advisors to confront him directly about his intentions. The Earl of Warwick, in particular, had been working tirelessly to arrange a diplomatically advantageous match with a French princess, and Edward's apparent reluctance to commit was beginning to damage England's international relations. The confrontation came during a royal council meeting, where Warwick pressed Edward to make a definitive commitment to the French marriage alliance. Faced with direct questions from his most trusted advisor, Edward finally admitted that such a marriage was impossible because he was already wed. The immediate reaction of the assembled nobles was stunned silence. The idea that their king, their very young, supposedly politically astute king, had married in secret without consulting anyone was almost impossible to comprehend. This was not merely a personal decision, but a fundamental violation of the expectations and protocols that governed medieval monarchy. Warwick's reaction was particularly intense. He had staked his own reputation on the success of the French negotiations, and Edward's revelation made him appear either incompetent or deliberately deceived. The man who had been instrumental in placing Edward on the throne suddenly found himself questioning whether his protégé possessed the judgment necessary to rule effectively. When Edward finally revealed the identity of his bride, the shock deepened into something approaching horror. Elizabeth Woodville was not merely an inappropriate choice due to her relatively humble birth. She was the widow of a Lancastrian knight who had died fighting against Edward's own forces. The political implications were staggering. The revelation that their king had married a former enemy's widow sent shockwaves through the assembled nobles. Here was not just a breach of protocol, but a decision that seemed to call into question Edward's most basic political instincts. How could a king who had shown such wisdom in military and governmental matters display such apparent foolishness in his personal life? The public announcement of the marriage was carefully staged at Reading Abbey on Michaelmas Day, September 29th, 1464. Edward appeared before the assembled court with Elizabeth at his side, presenting her not as his mistress or his intended bride, but as his wife and England's new queen. The ceremony was designed to emphasize the legitimacy of their union, while managing the inevitable political fallout. Elizabeth's first appearance as queen created a sensation. Dressed in cloth of gold and surrounded by all the ceremony that befitted her new position, she was a vision of queenly dignity and grace. Those who had expected to see a grasping commoner instead encountered a woman who carried herself with natural majesty, clearly born for the role fate had thrust upon her. But beneath the ceremonial splendor lay political tensions that would ultimately reshape the entire structure of Edward's reign. The elevation of the Woodville family from minor nobility to the heights of royal favor created resentments and opportunities that would echo through the remaining years of Edward's reign. Elizabeth brought with her an enormous family, 5 brothers, 7 sisters, and 2 sons from her previous marriage, all of whom suddenly found themselves connected to the royal family. Edward's generosity toward his new in-laws was both politically necessary and personally motivated, but it created a new power structure that threatened established noble hierarchies. The transformation of Elizabeth's father, Richard Woodville, from a minor knight to Earl Rivers and royal treasurer, illustrated the dramatic changes Edward's marriage had brought about. Overnight, a family that had struggled with financial difficulties found itself among the wealthiest and most influential in the kingdom. Even more controversial was Edward's determination to arrange advantageous marriages for Elizabeth's siblings. Her sister Margaret was married to Thomas, heir to the Earl of Arundel, while another sister, Mary, wed William Herbert's son. These alliances brought the Woodvilles into connection with some of England's most powerful noble families, often displacing matches that had been planned for years. The marriage of Elizabeth's 20-year-old brother John to Catherine Neville, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, caused particular scandal. Catherine was nearly 80 years old, and the union was clearly designed to secure the Woodville family's position, rather than create any genuine partnership. Critics mocked it as evidence of the family's naked ambition and Edward's poor judgment in indulging them. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence of Edward's marriage was its effect on England's foreign relations. Warwick's carefully constructed alliance with France lay in ruins, as King Louis XI felt insulted by Edward's rejection of the proposed marriage to a French princess. This diplomatic disaster would have consequences that reached far beyond simple hurt feelings. Louis I, one of medieval Europe's most calculating and vengeful monarchs, began to explore alternative approaches to English politics. If Edward would not be France's ally through marriage, perhaps he could be France's enemy through other means. The seeds of future conflict were being sown in the disappointment and anger generated by Edward's secret wedding. Meanwhile, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, recognized an opportunity to draw England into his sphere of influence. Burgundy and France were traditional enemies, and Edward's break with Louis XI created possibilities for a new alliance that might serve both nations' interests. The marriage of Edward's sister Margaret to Charles, 1468, would formalize this new diplomatic orientation. The domestic implications of Edward's marriage proved equally far-reaching. The elevation of the Woodville family created a new faction at court, one that owed its position entirely to royal favor, rather than inherited power or proven loyalty to the Yorkist cause. This development disturbed many established nobles who saw their own influence diluted by these newcomers. Elizabeth herself proved to be far more than merely a beautiful ornament for the royal court. She possessed genuine political skills and used her influence with Edward to advance not just her family's interests, but also her own vision of queenly behavior. Her court became a center of culture and learning, attracting scholars, artists, and musicians who enhanced the intellectual atmosphere of the royal household. The Queen's patronage of literature and the arts reflected both personal interests and political calculation. By surrounding herself with learned men and beautiful objects, Elizabeth reinforced her claim to legitimate queenship, while providing her husband's reign with the kind of cultural distinction that enhanced royal prestige throughout Europe. But Elizabeth's growing influence also created new sources of tension within the royal household. Nobles who had expected to maintain their privileged access to the king found themselves competing with a queen who clearly possessed her husband's ear and increasingly shaped his decisions. The informal masculine camaraderie that had characterized Edward's early reign gave way to a more formal court structure centered around the royal couple. The birth of Elizabeth and Edward's first child, also named Elizabeth, in February 1466, provided the new queen with additional legitimacy and security. Here was proof that God had blessed their union. Despite its unconventional origins, the princess was christened with all the ceremony befitting a potential heir to the throne. though Edward still hoped for male heirs to secure the dynasty's future. As the months passed, it became increasingly clear that Edward's marriage had fundamentally altered the political landscape of his reign. The easy partnership between the king and Warwick, which had been so crucial to Edward's early success, showed signs of strain that would eventually prove irreparable. Warwick's resentment centered not merely on the diplomatic embarrassment Edward's marriage had caused, but on what he saw as a fundamental betrayal of trust. The Earl had viewed himself as Edward's senior partner, the experienced statesman guiding a promising but inexperienced young king. The secret marriage revealed that Edward was capable of making momentous decisions without consultation, calling into question the entire basis of their relationship. The growing tension between Edward and Warwick was exacerbated by their different visions of England's international role. Warwick favoured the French alliance that Edward's marriage had made impossible, while the king increasingly leaned toward Burgundy as a more natural partner. This disagreement reflected not merely different diplomatic preferences, but fundamentally different approaches to royal authority and decision-making. Edward's confidence in his own judgment, always strong, was reinforced by his marriage's apparent success. Elizabeth had proven herself capable of fulfilling the demanding role of queen, bearing children who secured the succession and providing the kind of personal happiness that strengthened Edward's resolve to resist outside pressure. The lavish coronation of Queen Elizabeth in May 1465 served as both celebration and political statement. The ceremony demonstrated Edward's determination to honour his wife despite all criticism, while the magnificent pageantry showed that the royal treasury could support such displays despite the ongoing costs of securing the realm. Elizabeth's coronation procession through London became a public relations triumph that helped to establish her legitimacy in the eyes of the common people. Dressed in cloth of silver and crowned with a circlet of gold and precious stones, she embodied the kind of royal magnificence that ordinary subjects expected from their monarchy. The Queen's ability to win popular support proved crucial to the stability of Edward's reign. While nobles might question the wisdom of the royal marriage, common people were charmed by the romantic story of the beautiful widow who had won a king's heart through virtue rather than political calculation. But even as Edward and Elizabeth celebrated their apparent success, more perceptive observers could detect signs of the troubles ahead. Warwick's growing alienation, the resentment of displaced nobles, the diplomatic complications with France, all of these problems stemmed directly or indirectly from Edward's decision to marry for love rather than political advantage. The secret marriage that had brought Edward such personal happiness was about to extract a political price that would threaten everything he had worked to achieve. The handsome young king who had won his throne through military genius and personal charisma was about to discover that even the most successful rulers could be brought low by the unintended consequences of their private choices. As 1469 dawned, Edward seemed secure on his throne, blessed with a beautiful wife and growing family, master of a prosperous and peaceful kingdom. But beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would soon test every aspect of his character and ability. The love match that had brought such joy was about to become the catalyst for the greatest crisis of Edward's reign. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit the king against the man who had made his reign possible. Brother against brother, loyalty against ambition. The romantic fairy tale of the secret marriage was about to give way to the harsh realities of medieval politics, where personal happiness often proved to be the luxury that kings could least afford. Edward, the warrior who had never lost a battle, was about to face his most dangerous enemy, not a foreign invader or rival claimant, but the consequences of his own choices and the revenge of those who felt betrayed by the man they had helped to place upon the throne. The summer of 1469 brought troubling news to the royal court. Strange reports filtered south from Yorkshire of unrest and rebellion, led by mysterious figures with names that seem more suited to legend than reality. Robin of Redesdale and Robin of Holderness. These shadowy leaders spoke of grievances against the king's government, of excessive taxation and corrupt advisers, but their true identities remained hidden behind these romantic pseudonyms. Edward, now 27 and seasoned by 8 years of kingship, initially dismissed these disturbances as mere local troubles requiring only routine suppression. England had known sporadic unrest throughout his reign, usually fomented by die-hard Lancastrian sympathizers or ambitious local nobles seeking to improve their positions. But these new rebellions carried an ominous quality that gradually became impossible to ignore. The king's confidence in his ability to handle such challenges was not misplaced. His military record remained unblemished. His personal popularity with common people seemed undiminished, and his marriage to Elizabeth had produced a growing family that appeared to secure the dynasty's future. 3 daughters had blessed their union: Elizabeth in 1466, Mary in 1467, and Cecily in 1469. While the Queen's ability to bear children suggested that male heirs would eventually follow, but beneath the surface calm of Edward's court, political currents were shifting in ways that threatened the very foundations of his reign. The Earl of Warwick's resentment over the secret marriage had festered and grown, fed by each new sign of the Woodville family's rising influence and each reminder of his own diminished role in royal decision-making. Warwick's grievances extended beyond mere personal pique. As one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated political minds, he understood that Edward's marriage had fundamentally altered England's diplomatic position in ways that might prove catastrophic. The break with France had pushed Louis XI towards supporting England's enemies, while the new alliance with Burgundy carried risks of its own. More immediately threatening was the growing influence of the Woodville faction within Edward's government. Elizabeth's father, now Earl Rivers, held the crucial position of treasurer, while her brothers occupied other significant offices. This concentration of power in the hands of a single family, and one that owed its elevation entirely to the Queen's marriage, violated traditional expectations of how royal favours should be distributed. The situation was further complicated by the behaviour of Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Now 20 years old and possessed of the same striking good looks and personal charm as his royal brother, George had begun to chafe at his position as heir presumptive. The birth of Edward's daughters had not yet displaced him in the succession, but the Queen's fertility suggested that male heirs might eventually reduce his own prospects. George's character combined the worst aspects of royal blood: enormous pride, unlimited ambition, and a dangerous inability to accept subordination, with none of the compensating virtues that had made Edward such an effective king. Where Edward possessed genuine military talent, political acumen, and personal magnetism, George offered only the superficial attractiveness of royal birth, without the substance to justify his elevated position. Warwick, ever the master of political calculation, recognized in George both a potential ally and a possible alternative to Edward's increasingly independent kingship. The young Duke's resentment of his brother's marriage, his jealousy of Woodville influence, and his own ambition created opportunities that a man of Warwick's experience could exploit. The first open sign of trouble came in July 1469, when Warwick arranged the marriage of his elder daughter, Isabel Neville, to George, Duke of Clarence. This union was accomplished without Edward's knowledge or consent, a direct challenge to royal authority that announced Warwick's break with his former protégé. The wedding took place at Calais, the fortress city that remained under Warwick's control as captain. The ceremony itself was modest by royal standards, but its political implications were enormous. By marrying his daughter to the heir presumptive without royal permission, Warwick was effectively declaring his independence from Edward's authority, and perhaps even suggesting an alternative succession. From Calais, Warwick and George issued a manifesto that revealed the full extent of their rebellion. The document, written in Warwick's sophisticated diplomatic style, accused Edward of governing through evil counsellors, clearly meaning the Woodville family, and of pursuing policies harmful to England's interests. The rebels claimed to act not against the king personally, but against those who had led him astray. This manifesto represented a masterpiece of political propaganda, carefully crafted to appeal to various sources of discontent within Edward's kingdom. Nobles who resented Woodville influence, merchants troubled by economic policies, and common people suffering from taxation could all find reasons to support Warwick's cause. But the document's most dangerous aspect lay in its implicit threat to Edward's person. By claiming that the king was controlled by evil advisors, Warwick was reviving the traditional medieval justification for rebellion. The notion that loyal subjects had a duty to protect their monarch from those who led him astray, even if such protection required the use of force. Edward's initial response to Warwick's rebellion revealed both his military confidence and his political naivety. Rather than immediately mobilizing the full resources of royal government to crush this challenge, the king chose to treat it as a minor disturbance that could be resolved through negotiation and moderate force. This decision proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. While Edward moved north with a small army to deal with the mysterious Robin of Redesdale, Warwick's forces were landing in England with a much larger and better prepared military force. The rebels had used their months of preparation wisely, gathering both foreign support and domestic allies for a carefully coordinated campaign. The trap that Warwick had set for his former protégé became apparent on July 26, 1469, at the Battle of Edgecote Moor in Northamptonshire. Edward's army, caught between the forces of Robin of Redesdale, now revealed as Sir John Conyers, one of Warwick's supporters, and Warwick's main force, suffered a crushing defeat that shattered the myth of royal invincibility. The battle itself was relatively brief, but its consequences were enormous. Edward's army was not merely defeated but annihilated, with many of his most loyal supporters killed or captured. The king himself, along with a small group of survivors, was taken prisoner by Warwick's forces and transported to the Earl's stronghold at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. The imprisonment of King Edward IV represented one of the most shocking developments in English political history. Never before had a reigning monarch been captured by his own subjects and held against his will. The precedent was dangerous not merely for Edward personally, but for the entire institution of English kingship. Warwick's treatment of his royal prisoner revealed both his political sophistication and his ultimate uncertainty about how to proceed. Edward was accorded the respect due to his royal position, comfortable quarters, adequate food, the services of his personal attendants, but was nevertheless unmistakably a captive whose movements were strictly controlled. The Earl's dilemma was considerable. Having captured the king, Warwick found himself in the unprecedented position of holding the source of all legitimate authority within the realm. He could not simply release Edward without guarantees of future compliance, but neither could he easily justify continued detention of an anointed monarch. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Woodville faced her own crisis. The defeat and capture of her husband left her in an extremely vulnerable position, pregnant with their fourth child and surrounded by enemies who viewed her family as the source of England's troubles. Her response to this challenge revealed the steel that lay beneath her beautiful exterior. Rather than fleeing or seeking accommodation with Warwick, Elizabeth chose to take sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, one of the few places where even the Earl's authority could not reach her. This decision was both practically wise and symbolically powerful, presenting her as a wronged queen seeking divine protection, rather than a political partisan deserving punishment. The birth of Elizabeth's fourth child, a son finally named Edward, while she remained in sanctuary, created additional complications for Warwick's plans. Here was a potential male heir to the throne, born under dramatically symbolic circumstances that emphasized the Yorkist dynasty's continued legitimacy despite current troubles. Warwick's attempts to govern England through his captive king quickly encountered practical difficulties that had not been apparent during the planning stages of the rebellion. Noble families who had remained neutral during the initial crisis proved unwilling to accept orders issued in Edward's name, but clearly originating from Warwick's ambition. More seriously, fresh rebellions began to break out in different parts of the kingdom as various factions attempted to exploit the apparent collapse of royal authority. Lancastrian sympathizers saw opportunity in the Yorkist family's internal divisions, while local strongmen used the confusion to settle old scores or advance their own interests. The most dangerous of these new disturbances erupted in the north, where Lancastrian agents succeeded in capturing several important castles and briefly threatened to establish a permanent base for renewed resistance. Warwick found himself in the impossible position of needing Edward's cooperation to suppress these rebellions while simultaneously holding him prisoner. After several months of mounting difficulties, Warwick was forced to acknowledge that his coup had failed to achieve its primary objectives. Rather than creating a more manageable monarchy under his own guidance, the Earl's actions had unleashed forces that threatened to destroy the stability he claimed to be protecting. The release of King Edward in September 1469 was managed with careful attention to saving face on both sides. Warwick presented the decision as evidence of his loyalty and concern for the kingdom's welfare, while Edward accepted his restoration to full royal authority without immediately seeking revenge against his captors. This apparent reconciliation fooled no one who understood the personalities involved. Edward had experienced the ultimate humiliation for a medieval monarch, defeat in battle and imprisonment by his own subjects. Such an insult could not be forgotten or forgiven, regardless of public protestations of renewed harmony. Warwick, meanwhile, had demonstrated that he possessed both the will and the ability to depose a king, but lacked the resources to govern effectively in place of legitimate royal authority. The Earl's position was now more precarious than ever, as he had made an enemy of the king without achieving the goals that had motivated his rebellion. The uneasy peace that followed Edward's release lasted through the winter months of 1469 to 1470, but both sides used this time to prepare for renewed conflict. Edward quietly began rebuilding his military forces and securing the loyalty of nobles who had remained neutral during the crisis, while Warwick explored more radical alternatives to his current predicament. The breaking point came in March 1470, when Warwick orchestrated another rebellion, this time in Lincolnshire. The rising was ostensibly led by Sir Robert Wells, but Edward's intelligence network had improved considerably since the previous year's disasters, and the king quickly identified Warwick's hand behind the apparent local disturbance. Edward's response to this second challenge demonstrated how much he had learned from the previous year's humiliation. Rather than dividing his forces or underestimating his enemies, the king moved swiftly with a substantial army to crush the rebellion before it could gain momentum. The Battle of Lossicoat Field on March 12, 1470, provided Edward with both military victory and political vindication. Welles's forces were routed so completely that they threw away their distinctive livery badges while fleeing, giving the engagement its colourful name. More importantly, captured documents and testimony from prisoners provided clear evidence of Warwick and George's involvement in the rebellion. Faced with undeniable proof of their treason, Warwick and George had no choice but to flee England. Their departure for France marked the end of the most serious internal challenge to Edward's reign, but it also opened the door to even more dangerous complications involving foreign intervention and Lancastrian restoration. The transformation of Warwick from Edward's mentor to his most dangerous enemy represented one of the great personal tragedies of the 15th century politics. Two men who had once worked together to achieve remarkable success had allowed personal grievances and political differences to destroy their relationship and threaten the stability of the entire kingdom. For Edward, Warwick's betrayal was a profound personal wound that would influence his behavior for the remainder of his reign. The young king, who had once been generous with forgiveness and eager to reconcile former enemies, would become notably more suspicious and ruthless in dealing with potential threats. But the immediate crisis was far from over. In fleeing to France, Warwick had placed himself in the hands of Louis XI, England's most implacable enemy and one of medieval Europe's most cunning political manipulators. The Earl, who had once made Edward king, was about to attempt something even more audacious, remaking English politics through foreign intervention and alliance with his former enemies. The stage was set for the most dramatic reversal of fortune in English royal history, as the king, who had seemed invincible just months earlier, was about to lose his throne to the very man he had once trusted above all others. The betrayal that had begun with a secret marriage was about to reach its climax with the temporary destruction of the Yorkist dynasty and Edward's flight into exile. The October wind howled across the North Sea, carrying with it the salt spray and the promise of winter storms to come. In the harbour of Bruges, a small fleet of ships prepared for departure under cover of darkness, their holds filled not with the usual cargo of wool and wine, but with the dreams and desperate hopes of a fallen king. Edward IV, once the most powerful monarch in Europe, now stood on the deck of a modest vessel, watching the Flemish coast fade into the autumn mist behind him. The exile that had begun so ignominiously in September 1470 was about to end in one of history's most remarkable reversals of fortune. The king, who had fled England with barely a handful of loyal supporters, was returning with renewed purpose and a small but determined army, ready to stake everything on a single, audacious gamble to reclaim his throne. Edward's months of exile in the Low Countries had been both humiliating and instructive. The man who had once commanded the resources of an entire kingdom found himself dependent upon the charity of his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. This relationship, though ultimately supportive, had required careful management and considerable patience from a king accustomed to having his wishes immediately fulfilled. Charles had his own reasons for supporting Edward's restoration, but these were based on cold political calculation rather than family loyalty. Burgundy's rivalry with France made any enemy of Louis XI a potential ally, while Edward's return to power would restore the English alliance that served Burgundian interests. But Charles was also cautious, unwilling to commit too many resources to what appeared to be a desperate venture with limited prospects for success. The small army that Edward had gathered for his return journey reflected both the constraints of exile and the loyalty of those who had chosen to share his fortunes. Perhaps 2,000 men sailed with him, a force that would have been insignificant for a regular military campaign, but which represented everything he could muster for his attempt at restoration. Among Edward's companions were some of the most devoted supporters of his reign. His youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had remained steadfastly loyal throughout the crisis, demonstrating a reliability that contrasted sharply with George's betrayal. At 18, Richard was already proving himself to be both an capable military commander and a trusted political advisor. William, Lord Hastings, Edward's chamberlain and close personal friend, had also chosen exile rather than accommodation with the Warwick regime. Hastings brought not only personal loyalty, but also valuable connections throughout England that might prove crucial in gathering support for Edward's return. The plan for Edward's restoration was necessarily simple, as complex strategies would have been impossible to coordinate with such limited resources. The king would land in Yorkshire, where his personal estates and local connections might provide initial support. From there, he would need to move quickly toward London, gathering followers as he marched and seeking to bring the usurping regime to battle before it could fully mobilize against him. The choice of landing site reflected Edward's understanding of English politics and his own personal appeal. Yorkshire had been Yorkist territory since the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, and many of the region's noble families owed their current positions to Edward's patronage. If support could be found anywhere, it would be in these northern counties. The landing at Ravenspur on March 14th, 1471, deliberately echoed one of the most successful usurpations in English history. This same port had welcomed Henry of Bolingbroke in 1399, when he returned from exile to claim the throne as Henry IV. By choosing this location, Edward was making a symbolic statement about his own legitimacy and his confidence in ultimate victory. But the initial reception was far from encouraging. The important city of York, which Edward had hoped would welcome him as a liberator, instead closed its gates and refused him entry. Local nobles who had once competed for royal favour now seemed reluctant to commit themselves to what appeared to be a desperate venture with little hope of success. Edward's response to this setback revealed the political wisdom he had gained during his years of kingship and months of exile. Rather than attempting to storm York or abandoning his campaign in despair, he chose a middle course that demonstrated both prudence and tactical skill. The king announced that he had returned not to reclaim the throne immediately, but merely to recover his rightful inheritance as Duke of York. This claim was technically legal and politically astute, as it avoided the immediate challenge to Henry VI's restored authority, while establishing Edward's right to be in England and to gather supporters. This strategy proved effective in gradually building support for Edward's cause. Men who might have hesitated to join an open rebellion against the established government could justify supporting a duke's attempt to recover his inherited lands. The distinction was perhaps artificial, but it provided the psychological cover that many needed to make the crucial decision to support Edward's return. The first significant reinforcement came from Sir William Parr and Sir James Harrington, who brought about 600 men to Edward's banner. These commanders were particularly valuable not merely for the soldiers they provided, but for the political signal their defections sent to other potential supporters. If experienced military leaders were willing to risk everything on Edward's cause, perhaps his chances were better than they initially appeared. More importantly, news reached Edward that his brother George, Duke of Clarence, was reconsidering his alliance with Warwick. The marriage that had bound George to the Earl's cause was proving less advantageous than originally hoped, while Warwick's alliance with Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian cause created new complications for the ambitious young duke. George's potential reconciliation with Edward opened possibilities that transformed the entire strategic situation. As heir presumptive with his own network of supporters, George's return to the Yorkist cause would provide Edward with both additional military strength and enhanced political legitimacy. The meeting between the royal brothers took place near Coventry, where Warwick had established his headquarters while attempting to coordinate resistance to Edward's return. The Earl, demonstrating the same military caution that had served him well throughout his career, refused to leave the strong fortifications of the city to give battle to Edward's growing army. George's decision to abandon Warwick and return to his brother's allegiance was one of the crucial turning points of Edward's restoration campaign. The Duke's defection brought significant military reinforcements at a critical moment, while also dealing a psychological blow to the Earl's cause, from which it never recovered. The reconciliation between Edward and George was managed with careful attention to political necessity rather than personal emotion. Both brothers understood that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored, but they also recognized that their mutual survival depended upon cooperation against common enemies. Edward's handling of his brother's return revealed the political maturity he had gained through adversity. Rather than demanding humiliating submissions or elaborate ceremonies of forgiveness, the king simply accepted George back into his allegiance and moved forward with the more pressing business of reclaiming his throne. With his forces now substantially strengthened and his political position improving daily, Edward made the crucial decision to abandon the pretense of seeking only his ducal inheritance and openly proclaim his intention to reclaim the throne. This announcement transformed his campaign from a local rebellion into a full-scale challenge to the established government. The march toward London became a triumphal progress as news of Edward's growing strength reached communities throughout central England. Towns that had initially remained neutral now competed to demonstrate their loyalty to the returning king, while nobles who had hedged their bets during the early stages of the campaign now committed themselves fully to his cause. London's reception of Edward was particularly gratifying for a monarch who had spent months doubting whether he would ever see his capital again. The city's merchants and craftsmen, who had prospered under Edward's previous reign, welcomed his return with genuine enthusiasm. Their support was based on practical economic considerations rather than romantic loyalty, but it was no less valuable for being commercially motivated. Edward's entry into London on April 11th, 1471, marked the effective end of Henry VI's brief restoration to the throne. The unfortunate Lancastrian king, who had spent most of the previous 6 months as little more than a figurehead for Warwick's ambitions, was once again imprisoned in the Tower of London. But Edward understood that his hold on the throne remained precarious as long as Warwick's army remained intact and capable of challenging his authority. The Earl had finally abandoned his defensive position in Coventry and was marching toward London with a substantial force, seeking to reverse the political momentum that had carried Edward back to power. The confrontation between Edward and Warwick took place at Barnet, a small town north of London, on Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1471. The symbolism of fighting on Christianity's most holy day was not lost on either side, as both claimed to represent legitimate authority and divine favor. The Battle of Barnet was fought under some of the most challenging conditions in medieval military history. A thick fog had descended during the night, reducing visibility to mere yards and making coordinated movements almost impossible. Both armies were forced to fight virtually blind, often unable to distinguish friend from enemy until they were close enough to touch. Edward's tactical disposition revealed the military lessons he had learned during his years of success and recent months of adversity. He positioned his forces to take advantage of what little he could see of the terrain, while ensuring that his personal presence would be felt wherever the fighting was fiercest. The battle's outcome was determined by a series of misunderstandings and tactical errors that the dense fog made inevitable. Warwick's forces initially achieved success on one flank, but confusion about the identity of approaching reinforcements led to a disastrous case of friendly fire that shattered their formation at the crucial moment. Edward's personal role in the battle was decisive in ways that extended beyond mere military leadership. His towering figure, made even more distinctive by the royal surcoat he wore, provided a rallying point for his own troops while becoming a target for enemy attacks. The king fought with the same desperate courage that had characterized his early campaigns, understanding that defeat would mean not just political failure, but probable death. The death of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, in the closing stages of the battle, eliminated Edward's most dangerous enemy and the greatest threat to Yorkist rule. The man who had made Edward king, then tried to unmake him, died fighting on foot among his soldiers, a fate both heroic and tragic for one of the medieval England's most capable political leaders. Warwick's death represented more than just military victory for Edward. It symbolized the end of the era when overmighty subjects could challenge royal authority through private armies and foreign alliances. The king who returned from exile was notably more suspicious of noble independence and more determined to concentrate power in royal hands. But Edward's triumph at Barnet was incomplete, as long as other enemies remained in the field. Even as he celebrated victory over Warwick, news arrived that Margaret of Anjou had finally landed on the south coast with her son Prince Edward and a force of foreign mercenaries. The Lancastrian cause, seemingly destroyed at Barnet, suddenly possessed new leadership and renewed hope. The campaign that followed demonstrated Edward's military genius at its most brilliant. Understanding that speed was essential to prevent the junction of Lancastrian forces with potential Welsh allies, the king launched one of the most remarkable forced marches in military history. The race to prevent Margaret of Anjou from reaching Wales became a contest of endurance and will that tested both armies to their limits. Edward's forces covered extraordinary distances each day, often marching more than 40 miles through difficult terrain, while maintaining discipline and fighting effectiveness. The climactic encounter came at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, where Edward's exhausted but determined army finally cornered the Lancastrian forces. The battle that followed was even more decisive than Barnet, as it eliminated not just another enemy army, but the entire Lancastrian leadership. The death of Prince Edward of Wales in the battle effectively ended the Lancastrian dynasty's hopes of restoration. With the young prince dead and his father Henry VI a prisoner, the Red Rose of Lancaster had no obvious claimant around whom future rebellions could rally. Edward's conduct in victory at Tewkesbury revealed both his military prowess and his political ruthlessness. While he showed mercy to common soldiers who sought surrender, the king ensured that captured Lancastrian nobles faced swift execution. This harsh policy reflected lessons learned during his earlier, more lenient approach to defeated enemies. The mysterious death of Henry VI in the Tower of London on May 21st, 1471, removed the last potential focus for Lancastrian resistance, while the official cause was given as grief and disappointment upon hearing of his son's death. Few contemporaries doubted that the unfortunate king had been murdered on Edward's orders. This decision, while politically necessary from Edward's perspective, represented a moral burden that would shadow his later reign. The execution of defeated nobles was accepted practice in medieval warfare, but the killing of an anointed king crossed traditional boundaries and established dangerous precedents for the treatment of royal prisoners. Edward's restoration to the throne was now complete, but the experience of exile and the struggle to reclaim his crown had fundamentally changed both the king and the nature of his rule. The generous, trusting young monarch, who had first claimed the throne in 1461, had been replaced by a more calculating and suspicious ruler who understood that mercy could be a luxury he could not afford. The king, who had once relied heavily on noble supporters, now placed greater emphasis on personal control and royal authority. The lesson of Warwick's betrayal had been learned too well to be forgotten. Never again would Edward allow a single subject to accumulate the kind of power that could threaten royal supremacy. But the trials of 1470 to 1471 had also revealed Edward's remarkable resilience and ability to inspire loyalty, even in the darkest circumstances. The small group of men who had chosen exile rather than abandon their king had been rewarded with positions of trust and influence that they would retain for the remainder of Edward's reign. The restoration had been achieved through a combination of military skill, political acumen, personal courage, and perhaps most importantly, the loyalty of those who had chosen to share his exile. Edward IV had proven that a king's true strength lay not in the magnificence of his court or the extent of his treasury, but in his ability to inspire men to follow him even into apparent hopelessness. As the summer of 1471 dawned over an England once again united under Yorkist rule, Edward could survey his kingdom with the satisfaction of a man who had lost everything and won it back through his own efforts. The throne that had once seemed his by right of birth and conquest now felt truly earned through suffering and struggle. But the experiences of the past year had left their mark on both the king and his realm. The easy confidence of Edward's early reign had been tempered by the knowledge of how quickly fortune could turn, while the casual trust he had once placed in noble supporters had been replaced by a more careful assessment of loyalty and capability. The England that Edward ruled after 1471 would be different from the kingdom he had governed before Warwick's rebellion. The king who had learned the harsh lessons of betrayal and exile would prove to be a more effective ruler, but also a more solitary one, understanding that the ultimate responsibility for the realm's welfare could never be safely delegated to others, no matter how trusted they might appear. Edward IV had won his crown twice, first through youthful courage and the support of others, then through mature determination and his own resourcefulness. The second victory, achieved against seemingly impossible odds, established his reputation as one of medieval England's most remarkable monarchs and set the stage for what would prove to be the most successful period of his reign. The restoration was complete, but the real work of ruling was just beginning. Edward now possessed both the experience and the authority to reshape his kingdom according to his own vision, free from the constraints that had limited his earlier reign. The question that remained was how he would use this hard-won independence, and whether the lessons learned in exile would prove sufficient to secure his dynasty's future. The great hall of Westminster Palace shimmered in the candlelight of 1,000 flames, their warm glow reflecting off cloth of gold and precious jewels, until the entire chamber seemed to pulse with living fire. It was Christmas Eve, 1471, and King Edward IV was hosting a feast that would be remembered for generations as the epitome of royal magnificence. The king, now 29 and at the absolute height of his powers, moved through the assembled courtiers like a golden god, his laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls as he celebrated not merely the holy season, but his own remarkable triumph over every enemy who had dared to challenge his authority. The transformation of Edward's court following his restoration was nothing short of spectacular. Where once there had been the relative simplicity of a young king learning his craft, now there emerged a display of royal splendor designed to announce to all Europe that England possessed a monarch worthy of respect and perhaps a little fear. The traumatic experiences of 1470 to 1471 had taught Edward that perception mattered as much as reality in the dangerous game of medieval politics. The royal wardrobe alone represented a fortune that would have supported entire armies. Edward's personal collection of robes, doublets, and ceremonial garments was said to contain more cloth of gold than existed in some entire kingdoms. His favorite outfit for state occasions consisted of a doublet of purple silk embroidered with pearls and diamonds, over which he wore a robe of crimson velvet trimmed with ermine. The effect was deliberately overwhelming, designed to remind all observers that they stood in the presence of a king whose power was both real and magnificent. But Edward understood that true royal magnificence extended far beyond mere personal display. The court, that began to take shape after 1471, was carefully designed as a stage for the presentation of kingship, as both art and political statement. Every ceremony, every feast, every moment of public visibility was choreographed to reinforce the message that England possessed a monarch who combined strength with sophistication. The physical transformation of royal residences reflected Edward's new approach to kingship. Westminster Palace was extensively renovated and expanded, with new chambers designed specifically for the elaborate ceremonial that now characterized court life. The royal apartments were redecorated with tapestries depicting Edward's military victories, while the great halls were furnished with tables and chairs suitable for entertaining hundreds of guests in appropriate splendor. Windsor Castle, which Edward had chosen as his primary residence, and the eventual mausoleum of his dynasty, underwent even more dramatic changes. The king commissioned the complete reconstruction of St. George's Chapel, intending it to rival the greatest religious buildings in Europe, while serving as the eternal resting place of Yorkist monarchs. The chapel's soaring Gothic arches and magnificent stained glass windows created a space worthy of a king who saw himself as God's chosen representative on earth. Edward's patronage of the arts and learning reflected both genuine personal interests and calculated political policy. The king understood that cultural achievement enhanced royal prestige in ways that military victory alone could not accomplish. A monarch who could attract the finest artists, scholars, and musicians to his court was demonstrating the kind of sophisticated power that impressed foreign ambassadors and domestic subjects alike. The royal library that Edward assembled became one of the finest in Europe, containing illuminated manuscripts commissioned from the greatest craftsmen in Flanders and France. These books were not merely decorative objects, but working documents that the king actually read and studied. His collection included works on military strategy, political theory, history, and literature, reflecting the broad intellectual interest that lay beneath his reputation for pleasure-seeking. William Caxton, who established England's first printing press in the precincts of Westminster Abbey, found in Edward both patron and collaborator. The king's support for this revolutionary technology demonstrated his understanding that the dissemination of knowledge could serve royal interests by creating a more educated and informed population. The first book printed in England, the Dictes and Sayings of the Philosophers, was actually translated by Edward's brother-in-law, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. But it was Edward's personal lifestyle that truly captured contemporary imagination and later historical judgment. The king, who had once been praised for his military prowess and political acumen, now became famous throughout Europe for the magnificent excess of his daily existence. Every aspect of royal life was conducted on a scale that seemed designed to test the limits of what even a wealthy kingdom could support. The royal kitchens employed hundreds of cooks, servers, and food preparers, whose sole responsibility was ensuring that Edward's table reflected his status as one of Europe's great monarchs. A typical feast might include dozens of courses, each more elaborate than the last, featuring exotic delicacies imported from across the known world. Peacocks roasted and re-feathered to appear alive, subtleties sculpted from sugar and spices, wines from the finest vineyards of France and Germany. No expense was spared in creating meals that were as much theatrical performance as nourishment. Edward's own appetite became legendary, even among an age accustomed to conspicuous consumption. The king's physicians noted his use of emetics, which allowed him to purge his stomach during meals and return to eating with renewed enthusiasm. This practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was not uncommon among wealthy medieval nobles who viewed the ability to consume vast quantities of food as both pleasure and symbol of status. The court's entertainment reflected the same commitment to magnificent excess that characterized every other aspect of royal life. Edward maintained troops of musicians, dancers, and actors whose performances transformed Westminster Palace into a constant stage for royal pleasure. The king himself was known to participate in these entertainments, his natural grace and commanding presence making him an effective performer as well as audience. Tournaments and martial displays provided opportunities for Edward to demonstrate that his legendary military skills remained sharp despite his increasingly luxurious lifestyle. These events, staged with theatrical grandeur that rivaled anything produced in medieval Europe, allowed the king to maintain his warrior reputation while indulging his taste for spectacle and ceremony. But perhaps nothing captured the attention of contemporaries more than Edward's notorious relationships with women. The king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been based on genuine love, and by all accounts, their relationship remained affectionate and passionate throughout their lives together. But Edward's appetites extended far beyond his marriage bed, and his affairs became a constant source of gossip, scandal, and political concern. The most famous of Edward's mistresses was Jane Shore, the wife of a London goldsmith who became so closely associated with the king that her influence was said to extend to matters of policy and patronage. Jane was celebrated not merely for her beauty, but for her intelligence and wit, qualities that apparently appealed to Edward as much as her more obvious physical attractions. Jane Shore's relationship with the king illustrated the complex intersection of personal pleasure and political power that characterized Edward's later reign. While officially merely a royal mistress, Jane wielded influence that rivaled that of many noble courtiers. Her recommendations could secure positions and favors, while her displeasure might result in exclusion from royal grace. The moral implications of Edward's conduct troubled many of his subjects, particularly those of strong religious conviction. The contrast between the king's private behavior and his public role as defender of Christian virtue created tensions that his enemies would later exploit. Contemporary chroniclers noted that Edward's reputation for sexual excess damaged his standing with the church and provided ammunition for those who questioned his fitness to rule. But Edward's most significant romantic entanglements extended beyond casual affairs to relationships that produced acknowledged illegitimate children. Arthur Plantagenet, who would later become Viscount Lisle, was generally accepted as Edward's son by Elizabeth Lucy. Other children were attributed to the king with varying degrees of certainty, creating a complex network of royal bastards whose existence complicated questions of succession and inheritance. The king's treatment of his illegitimate children revealed both his generosity and his understanding of political necessity. While he could not provide them with claims to the throne, Edward ensured that his acknowledged bastards received positions and financial support appropriate to their royal blood. This policy helped to secure their loyalty while avoiding the creation of alternative focal points for political opposition. Edward's relationship with his legitimate family during this period combined genuine affection with careful attention to dynastic requirements. The royal couple's marriage continued to produce children at regular intervals. Margaret in 1472, Richard in 1473, Anne in 1475, George in 1477, Catherine in 1479, and Bridget in 1480. This large family provided both personal happiness and political security through multiple heirs to continue the Yorkist line. The education and upbringing of Edward's children reflected his understanding that future monarchs would face challenges different from those he had confronted. The young princes were trained not merely in the traditional martial arts, but in languages, literature, and the complex diplomatic skills that modern kingship required. The princesses received educations that would prepare them for marriage alliances that might strengthen England's international position. Edward's eldest son, who shared his father's name and would eventually be proclaimed Edward V, was established in his own household at Ludlow Castle under the guidance of Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It provided the young prince with practical experience in governance, strengthened Woodville influence within the royal family, and established Edward V's presence in Wales as a symbol of royal authority. The elaborate court culture that surrounded Edward's children was designed to prepare them for their future roles, while reinforcing the dynasty's prestige in the present. Royal baptisms, coming-of-age ceremonies, and marriage negotiations were conducted with magnificent ceremony that announced the Yorkist family's confidence in its permanent establishment on the English throne. But beneath the surface of this domestic success lay currents that would eventually prove dangerous to the dynasty's survival. Edward's generous treatment of the Woodville family, while politically necessary given his marriage, continued to create resentment among nobles who felt displaced by these relative newcomers. The elevation of Elizabeth's brothers and sisters to positions of wealth and influence remained a source of tension that Edward's enemies could exploit. More subtly, the king's emphasis on magnificent display and personal pleasure was beginning to create financial pressures that threatened the long-term stability of royal government. The costs of maintaining Edward's luxurious lifestyle, combined with the expenses of his building projects and military preparations, strained even England's improving economic resources. Edward's approach to these financial challenges revealed both his commercial acumen and his willingness to exploit every available source of royal revenue. The king personally engaged in trade, using royal ships to transport wool and other commodities to continental markets. This direct involvement in commerce was unusual for a medieval monarch, but it reflected Edward's understanding that royal dignity need not prevent profitable enterprise. The development of royal monopolies and trading privileges provided another source of income that helped to support Edward's expensive lifestyle. By granting exclusive rights to import certain goods or practice particular trades, the king could generate substantial revenues while creating networks of merchants and craftsmen who had direct interests in supporting royal authority. Edward's diplomatic relations during this period were carefully calculated to support both his political interests and his personal preferences for luxury and display. The Treaty of Picquigny with France in 1475, while disappointing to those who hoped for military glory, provided England with substantial annual payments that helped to fund royal extravagance without requiring parliamentary taxation. The elaborate ceremony surrounding Edward's meeting with Louis XI at Picquigny demonstrated the king's genius for combining practical politics with theatrical display. The two monarchs met on a bridge specially constructed for the occasion, with both sides determined to outdo the other in magnificent costume and ceremonial protocol. Edward's personal appearance, tall, handsome, magnificently dressed, and radiating confident authority, reportedly impressed even the sophisticated French court. The financial benefits of the French alliance extended beyond the immediate payments to include opportunities for profitable trade and reduced military expenses. Edward understood that peace with France, however inglorious it might appear to those who craved military adventure, provided his kingdom with the stability necessary for economic development, and his court with the resources necessary to maintain its magnificent lifestyle. But Edward's most lasting achievement during this period was his transformation of English governmental administration. The king's personal attention to detail, combined with his commercial experience and political acumen, resulted in administrative reforms that significantly improved royal efficiency and effectiveness. The revival of royal councils in Wales and the north provided Edward with more effective means of governing distant regions, while creating new opportunities for rewarding loyal supporters with positions of responsibility. These councils, while nominally headed by royal princes, were actually administered by experienced officials who reported directly to the king. Edward's use of the chamber system for financial administration bypassed traditional treasury procedures and allowed for more direct royal control over governmental resources. This innovation reflected the king's determination to avoid the kind of financial dependence on parliamentary grants that might limit his freedom of action. The development of a more sophisticated diplomatic service enabled Edward to maintain England's international position through negotiation rather than expensive military campaigns. Royal ambassadors, carefully chosen for their skills and personally loyal to the king, provided Edward with intelligence and negotiating capabilities that enhanced his ability to pursue English interests without the costs and risks of warfare. As the 1470s progressed, Edward's court reached heights of magnificence that had never before been achieved by an English monarchy. Foreign visitors regularly commented on the wealth, sophistication, and sheer scale of royal display, noting that Westminster Palace rivaled the greatest courts of continental Europe in its splendor and cultural achievement. The king himself, now in his mid-30s, had grown somewhat portly from his indulgent lifestyle, but his commanding presence and natural charisma remained undiminished. Edward's ability to charm both individual courtiers and large audiences was as effective as ever, while his reputation for generosity ensured a steady stream of visitors seeking royal favor and patronage. The Christmas celebrations of 1477 perhaps represented the absolute pinnacle of Edward's magnificent lifestyle. The 12 days of festivities reportedly cost more than some kingdoms spent on their entire annual governmental expenses, while the entertainments and ceremonies provided a display of royal power that impressed even the most sophisticated international observers. But even as Edward celebrated his apparent success, careful observers could detect signs of the problems that would eventually threaten his dynasty's survival. The enormous costs of maintaining such magnificent display were beginning to strain even England's improved finances, while the king's personal indulgences were affecting his health in ways that would have long-term consequences. The birth of Edward's son George in 1477, while welcomed as additional security for the dynasty, also highlighted the king's failure to provide for an orderly succession should he die, while his heir remained a minor. Unlike his predecessors, Edward had not established clear procedures for regency or guardianship that might prevent the kind of political conflicts that had plagued previous royal minorities. More ominously, Edward's treatment of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, was becoming increasingly harsh as the king's suspicions about family loyalty intensified. The experiences of 1470 to 1471 had taught Edward to trust no one completely, but this lesson was creating new tensions within the royal family that threatened to undermine the dynasty from within. As 1478 dawned, Edward IV stood at the height of his power and prestige, master of a prosperous kingdom and head of a magnificent court that was admired throughout Europe. But the seeds of future troubles were already germinating, nourished by the very success and excess that seemed to guarantee the dynasty's permanent triumph. The king, who had learned to win battles through courage and determination, was about to discover that the greatest threats to his legacy would come not from foreign enemies or domestic rebels, but from the unintended consequences of his own choices and the inexorable passage of time. The golden years of magnificent excess were approaching their end, and with them would come challenges that would test every aspect of Edward's character and political skill. The winter of 1482 brought an unusual chill to the royal chambers of Westminster Palace, a cold that seemed to penetrate not merely the ancient stone walls, but the very soul of King Edward IV. At barely 40 years of age, the monarch, who had once been celebrated throughout Europe for his remarkable physical strength and vitality, now found himself increasingly troubled by ailments that his physicians could neither fully diagnose nor effectively treat. Edward's decline had been gradual but unmistakable to those who had known him in his prime. The tall, athletic figure that had once dominated every battlefield and charmed every court was now considerably heavier, his once golden hair showing threads of grey, and his legendary energy noticeably diminished. The costs of 20 years of kingship, combined with the excesses of his magnificent lifestyle, were finally demanding payment. The king's physicians, the finest medical minds available in 15th century Europe, offered various explanations for their royal patient's declining health. Some attributed his problems to the excessive use of emetics, which had allowed him to indulge his enormous appetite, but had apparently damaged his digestive system. Others pointed to the accumulated stress of constant political pressure and the traumatic experiences of betrayal and exile that had marked his reign. But perhaps the most perceptive observers understood that Edward was suffering from something more complex than simple physical ailment, a spiritual exhaustion born of the recognition that all his magnificent achievements might prove temporary, and that the dynasty he had worked so hard to establish remained vulnerable to the same forces that had nearly destroyed it before. The immediate cause of Edward's final illness remained mysterious, even to those who witnessed its progression. In March 1483, the king was still actively participating in governmental business and planning new initiatives to strengthen royal authority. By early April, however, he had taken to his bed with symptoms that quickly worsened beyond all hope of recovery. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward's final illness began with what appeared to be a severe fever, possibly contracted during a fishing expedition on the Thames. The king had always been fond of outdoor activities, despite his increasing weight, and the combination of cold spring weather and physical exertion may have triggered the crisis that would prove fatal. As news of the king's condition spread through the court and then throughout the kingdom, the full extent of Edward's failure to provide for an orderly succession became terrifyingly apparent. His heir, Edward V, was still only 12 years old and living in Wales under the guardianship of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The prospect of another royal minority, with all its attendant dangers, filled thoughtful observers with dread. Edward's final days were marked by desperate attempts to secure his dynasty's survival through last-minute provisions and political arrangements that might have been made years earlier had he been less confident in his own longevity. The king's will, hastily amended as his condition deteriorated, named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector during his son's minority, a decision that would prove to have catastrophic consequences. The choice of Richard as protector reflected both Edward's trust in his youngest brother's loyalty and his failure to understand the full implications of the political situation he was creating. Richard had indeed remained faithful throughout all the crises of Edward's reign, but his appointment to such a position of authority inevitably created opportunities and temptations that might prove too great for any man to resist. On April 9, 1483, King Edward IV died in his bed at Westminster Palace, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. His death marked the end of one of the most remarkable reigns in English history. 22 years of rule that had seen military triumph, political innovation, cultural achievement, and magnificent excess. But it also marked the beginning of a crisis that would ultimately destroy everything he had worked to accomplish. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed the fundamental weakness of his political arrangements. The Woodville family, which had risen to such prominence through Elizabeth's marriage to the king, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to enemies who had been waiting years for an opportunity to strike back. Without Edward's protection, the Queen's relatives were exposed to the resentments and ambitions of nobles who had never accepted their elevation. Elizabeth Woodville herself, despite her years of experience as Queen, found herself in an impossible position. Her son was the rightful king, but he was still a child who would need protection and guidance during the dangerous transition period. The Queen's natural desire to maintain her family's influence conflicted with political realities that made compromise with other factions essential for her son's survival. The most immediate crisis centered on the question of who would control the young Edward V during the crucial early months of his reign. Rivers had custody of the boy king at Ludlow Castle, but Richard of Gloucester, as designated protector, had equal claim to authority over his nephew. The potential for conflict between these two power centres was obvious to all observers. Richard's initial response to his brother's death appeared both appropriate and reassuring. The Duke publicly proclaimed his loyalty to Edward V and began making arrangements for the boy's coronation, scheduled for early summer. But beneath this proper exterior lay calculations and ambitions that would soon transform England's political landscape. The meeting between Richard and Rivers at Northampton, ostensibly arranged to coordinate their joint escort of Edward V to London, instead became the first act in a drama that would end with the disappearance of the princes and the destruction of the Yorkist dynasty. Richard's arrest of Rivers, along with the young king's half-brother Richard Grey and his chamberlain Thomas Vaughan, announced his intention to seize complete control over his nephew. Edward V's reaction to his uncle's actions revealed both the intelligence he had inherited from his father and the political naivety that his youth made inevitable. The 12-year-old king reportedly protested his uncle's treatment of his guardians, but lacked the power or experience to prevent Richard's carefully planned coup. The young king's escort to London became a triumphal progress for Richard, who presented himself as the legitimate protector, acting to protect his nephew from evil counsellors. This narrative, while politically useful, masked the reality that Edward V was now effectively Richard's prisoner, dependent upon his uncle's goodwill for his safety and his throne. Elizabeth Woodville's response to these developments demonstrated both her political acumen and her growing desperation. Recognizing that Richard's actions threatened not only her own position, but her children's lives, the Queen made the fateful decision to take sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. The Queen's flight to sanctuary created a constitutional crisis that revealed the inadequacy of existing legal and political frameworks for dealing with such unprecedented situations. While sanctuary was a recognized legal right, its application to a reigning monarch's family raised questions that medieval law had never contemplated. Richard's initial attempts to persuade Elizabeth to leave sanctuary and entrust her children to his protection were unsuccessful, demonstrating that the Queen understood better than most observers the true nature of her brother-in-law's ambitions. Her refusal to surrender her younger son created additional complications for Richard's plans and helped to expose the fundamental illegitimacy of his actions. The revelation of allegations concerning Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville provided Richard with the legal pretext he needed to justify his seizure of the throne. Bishop Robert Stillington's claims that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry Eleanor Butler before his secret wedding to Elizabeth were almost certainly fabricated, but they served their political purpose by casting doubt on the legitimacy of Edward's children. The speed with which these allegations emerged and were accepted by Parliament suggested that Richard's coup had been planned well in advance of Edward IV's death. the transformation of a loyal brother and dutiful protector into a usurping uncle, could not have been accomplished overnight, implying that Richard had been considering such possibilities even during Edward's lifetime. The parliamentary act known as Titulus Regius, which formally declared Edward's children illegitimate and proclaimed Richard as the rightful king, represented one of the most shameful episodes in English legislative history. The assembled lords and commons, intimidated by Richard's military strength and uncertain about the alternatives, chose political expedience over justice and legal principle. Edward V's deposition, accomplished without any formal ceremony or personal confrontation between uncle and nephew, marked the effective end of his brief reign. The boy, who had been king for barely 2 months, found himself stripped of crown and title, officially reduced to the status of bastard and traitor's son. The removal of Edward V's younger brother from sanctuary, accomplished through a combination of threats and promises that Elizabeth Woodville was powerless to resist, completed Richard's control over Edward IV's male heirs. Both boys were now housed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their own protection, but effectively as Richard's prisoners. The coronation of Richard III on July 6, 1483, was conducted with all the ceremony and magnificence that medieval kingship required, but it could not disguise the fundamental illegitimacy of his claim or the violent methods by which he had achieved power. The new king's attempts to present himself as a rightful ruler protecting the realm from disorder convinced few observers and created immediate opposition. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower during the late summer of 1483 eliminated the most obvious focal points for resistance to Richard's rule, but it also created a mystery that would haunt his reign and taint his historical reputation. Whether the boys died by Richard's direct order, through neglect, or by some other means remained unclear, but their removal from public view suggested the worst possible interpretation. The rebellion that erupted in October 1483, led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, demonstrated that Richard's seizure of power had created more problems than it had solved. The new king's attempts to legitimize his position had failed to convince significant portions of the political nation, while his treatment of his nephews had alienated even former supporters. Henry Tudor's emergence as an alternative claimant to the throne provided Richard's enemies with a focal point for their opposition, and transformed what might have remained a series of local rebellions into a genuine threat to the usurper's survival. Tudor's promise to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, created the possibility of uniting Yorkist and Lancastrian claims in a way that could appeal to war-weary subjects. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, brought Richard III's troubled reign to a violent end and completed the destruction of the Yorkist dynasty that Edward IV had worked so hard to establish. Richard's death in battle, fighting bravely against overwhelming odds, provided him with a soldier's end that partially redeemed his reputation but could not undo the damage his actions had caused. The crown that had fallen from Richard's head into a thorn bush was placed upon Henry Tudor's brow, beginning a new dynasty that would rule England for more than a century. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York fulfilled his promise to unite the warring factions and symbolically ended the Wars of the Roses that had begun with Edward IV's father's rebellion. The irony of Edward IV's legacy was profound and tragic. The king, who had won his crown twice through military genius and personal courage, who had created one of medieval Europe's most magnificent courts, and who had brought prosperity and stability to his kingdom, had ultimately failed in the most basic royal duty, ensuring his dynasty's survival. Edward's personal choices, from his secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville through his indulgent lifestyle and his failure to provide adequate safeguards for a minority reign, had created the conditions that made his brother's usurpation possible. The love match that had brought him such happiness had also planted the seeds of his family's destruction. The disappearance and presumed murder of Edward's sons represented not merely personal tragedy, but dynastic catastrophe. The boys who should have continued their father's line instead became symbols of the dangers that faced royal children in an age when political necessity often overrode family loyalty and moral principle. Elizabeth Woodville's fate after Bosworth reflected both the new dynasty's desire for reconciliation and the former queen's recognition that her active political career was over. Her withdrawal to Bermondsey Abbey, while officially voluntary, effectively ended any remaining Woodville influence in English politics and symbolized the complete reversal of the family's fortunes. The Yorkist cause, which had seemed so triumphant during Edward's restored reign, disappeared with remarkable speed after Bosworth. The pretenders Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck would later claim to represent surviving Yorkist princes, but their failures demonstrated that the dynasty's moment had passed and that England was ready for new leadership. Edward IV's architectural and cultural legacy proved more durable than his political achievements. St. George's Chapel at Windsor, completed after his death, stands as a monument to his vision of royal magnificence and his understanding that kings must create beauty as well as impose order. The manuscripts in his library, the artistic works he commissioned, and the cultural innovations he supported enriched English civilization in ways that survived political change. Perhaps most poignantly, Edward's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval kingship. His military genius, personal charisma, and administrative skills had enabled him to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and create a golden age of prosperity and cultural achievement. But his failure to transcend the personal appetites and political miscalculations that marked his private life ultimately doomed his dynasty to extinction. As the 15th century drew toward its close, thoughtful observers could reflect upon the lessons of Edward IV's remarkable but ultimately tragic reign. His story served as a reminder that even the most talented and successful rulers remained vulnerable to the consequences of their personal choices, and that the stability of kingdoms depended upon more than the virtues or vices of individual monarchs. The king, who had earned his crown twice through courage and determination, had lost it forever through the choices he made in victory and the enemies he created through success. Edward IV's legacy would live on in England's constitutional development, cultural achievement, and historical memory. But his dynasty died with the boys who vanished into the darkness of the Tower, victims of the very power struggles their father had thought he had mastered. The golden age of magnificent excess had ended in dynastic tragedy, but the memory of what had been achieved would inspire future generations and remind them that greatness was possible even in the most difficult circumstances. Edward IV, the Playboy king who fought his way back to the throne, had created wonders and committed follies in equal measure, leaving behind a legacy as complex and fascinating as the man himself. In the quiet chambers where he had died, only the echo of his laughter remained, a ghostly reminder of the vitality and ambition that had once shaken the foundations of the medieval world. The age of Edward IV was over, but its impact upon English history would endure as long as people remembered the remarkable story of the warrior king who loved too much, trusted too little, and dreamed of glories that even he could not secure forever. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through the life of one of England's most captivating monarchs. Edward IV's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, courage and determination can triumph over seemingly impossible odds, while also teaching us that personal choices have consequences that echo through generations. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, perhaps you might dream of those magnificent medieval courts, of brave knights and beautiful queens, of the pageantry and romance of a world where kings could lose their crowns and win them back through sheer force of will. Rest well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with all the wonder and magic that history's greatest stories can provide. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the remarkable life of Edward IV. Sweet dreams, and until we meet again in the gentle realm of Sleepy Crown, where history's most fascinating tales await to carry you softly into the land of dreams.